I'm sensing a lot of distractions affecting my everyday life. I'm trying to adopt better habits and want to start reading, but I'm wondering what genres you all enjoy. Do you ever go to a public place to read? I'm sure people will suggest to read what you enjoy, but I'm still figuring that out. For movies and television, I like fantasy, crime, mystery, thriller, science fiction, and action. Thank you. Story 1. Red Rising. I cannot shout it loud enough. There are 6 total books with a 7th coming. It's a futuristic world with space battles, sword battles, and a lot of wit. Story 2. I finished reading 1 Second After by William R. Forstchen. It is a fictional story about a town after an electromagnetic pulse attack. The narrative is quite captivating. Story 3. To be honest, I don't read any fiction. I prefer nonfiction books about politics, history, science, and other topics. I feel like I'm learning something that way. Story 4. I love zombie fiction and read or listen to at least one a week. I highly recommend Mountain Man by Keith C. Blackmore. That series is epic, telling the story of an average tradesman trying to survive the zombie apocalypse. It is well written and engaging. If you want to try science fiction, I recommend the Expeditionary Force series by Craig Allenson. It is a military science fiction series that is both funny and enjoyable. Additionally, the Galaxy's Edge series by Ansbach and Cole presents a Star Wars clone in a military science fiction style. Story 5. Try Philip K. Dick, Douglas Adams, Chuck Palahniuk, author of Fight Club, Terry Pratchett, and Andy Weir, author of The Martian and other great works. The series Memories of Earth's Past is a fantastic read. The Netflix series The Three-Body Problem is based on it. The TV show is well made, but it's better if you read the books first. Then there are classics like Isaac Asimov, H.G. Wells, and Larry Niven. One of my favorites is the Ender's Game series by Orson Scott Card, especially Ender's Shadow. You might consider audiobooks. I listen to them almost every day at work. If your job isn't suitable for it, think about listening in your car or while doing chores like cleaning and cooking. If you read any of them and want to discuss, feel free to reach out. Have fun. Story 6. The First Law series by Joe Abercrombie is fantastic. Any books by Kurt Vonnegut offer great comedy. The Expanse series is excellent for science fiction. Get a library card and use Libby. Why limit yourself to just one genre? Explore them all. Story 7. Science fiction and fantasy novels for pleasure. Scientific papers and textbooks for work. I am also writing a fantasy novel, with 5 chapters and approximately 16,000 words so far. Story 8. The Devil in the White City and the Three-Body Problem trilogy are the best books I have read in recent years. Story 9. In the last few years, I have been reading primarily from Black Library. I am nearly halfway through the Horus Heresy series. I wouldn't say this helps with brain rot in any way. Quite the opposite, but it's something I enjoy. I have read some works by Tom Clancy and Robert Ludlum before and enjoyed them, but I honestly prefer wholly fantastical stories more. Story 10. Nonfiction, fiction, self-improvement, educational, mystery, thriller, and more. I can't read in public. It's hard to focus. I prefer reading in bed or on the couch. Story 11. I enjoy reading books that challenge me intellectually. A good start. Memories, Dreams, and Reflections by Carl Jung. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Story 12. I mix nonfiction and fiction. Nonfiction helps you learn, while fiction provides interesting ideas to consider. Story 13. A mix of motivational books in areas where I feel I am lacking: World War II documentaries and biographies of interesting people. Story 14. Military books. I am currently reading House to House by David Belavia, a Medal of Honor recipient for his actions in Fallujah in 2004. I was not in the military, so I find these kinds of reads very interesting and slightly motivating. If they can operate like that daily, I can sit in front of my computer for 8 hours a day. Story 15. I read many genres across various formats, including paper, ebook, and audiobook, depending on the content and my mood. Here is a selection of books I have enjoyed in recent years. Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. Set Boundaries, Find Peace. Ancillary Justice. Murderbot Series. Entangled Life. The Pathless Path. Helgoland. Story 16. I read widely across various genres. I enjoy bibliographies and history related to current conflicts, such as The Lions of Kandahar, They Fought for Each Other, and Outlaw Platoon. Having been in those regions, I appreciate the personal connections and find it easier to visualize the content. I also read leadership books, including General Patton's Principles for Life and Leadership, as well as fantasy works like Dragonlance, Diablo, and Warcraft, and comedic stories from Tucker Max. Story 17. I really enjoy all types of books if there is something unusual or peculiar happening. This usually includes horror, fantasy, and science fiction, but I will appreciate any genre that has something intriguing to capture my interest. Story 18. It is not widely known or defined, but narrative nonfiction encompasses fascinating stories from history, such as A Land So Strange. Spanish conquistadors in Cuba intended to reach Mexico but mistakenly landed in Florida. They decided to walk up the coast with their ship following them. When the ship disappeared, they began to starve and melted down their guns to create axes for cutting down trees. They constructed rafts to float across the Gulf of Mexico, mistakenly believing it was the Atlantic Ocean, in hopes of returning to Spain. This sets the stage for the first couple of chapters, while the rest of the book details their 10-year journey across America, all in an effort to return home. Endurance is another compelling account, detailing an Arctic expedition. Stories like these inspire gratitude and motivation while offering insights into what life was once like for others. Story 19. Mostly science fiction and detective fiction with some fantasy and non-fiction history included. If you are looking for a good science fiction series to explore, The Expanse is superb. A recent fantasy series I enjoyed was The Dresden Files, which I also loved. Story 20. I'm not sure if you'd be interested, but I'm going to list my favorites. I primarily enjoy nonfiction, particularly in philosophy, history, and political science. I've marked some of my absolute favorites with asterisks. I hope you try one, but good luck and happy reading either way. History and political science. Specifically the history of how the far right has come to power today. One Nation Under God by Kevin M. Cruz. Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes Dumez. Shadow Network by and Nelson. The Scheme by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and Jennifer Mueller. Dark Money by Jane Mayer. Democracy in Chains by Jane Mayer. The Undertow by Jess Charlotte. The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory by Tim Alberta. The Power Worshippers by Catherine Stewart. The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wungro. Not about the far right. Philosophy. Almost all favorites. Incognito by David Eagleman. Philosophy/psychology. A Decent Life by Todd May. Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. Plato's Symposium by Plato. Allegory of the Cave by Plato. History of Sexuality by Michel Foucault. Discipline and Punishment by Michel Foucault. Field Work in Familiar Places, Morality, Culture, and Philosophy by Michelle Moody Adams. Simone Weil, Maybe Just Some Essays. Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. Any Works by Noam Chomsky. Maybe Manufacturing Consent. And many more. Roman History *. The Storm Before the Storm by Mike Duncan. Emperor of Rome by Mary Beard. SPQR by Mary Beard. Geopolitics *. How States Think by John Mearsheimer and Sebastian Rosato. The Tragedy of Great Power Politics by John Mearsheimer. Undetermined Category *. Drug Use for Grown-Ups by Dr. Carl L. Hart. Really good, still nonfiction. The Immortality Key by Brian C. Murarescu. Despite the controversy, I found it fun and thought-provoking, though its legitimacy may be debated. Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I enjoyed this more than I expected. It's not usually my type, but I looked forward to reading more each time I put it down. Story 21. Kafka, Camus, Sartre, Heidegger, Dostoevsky, Kundera, Murakami, Hesse, Douglas Adams, Terry Pratchett, Buddha Shankara. Story 22. I have started reading classics. It began with the literature we were supposed to read in high school, but most of us skimmed it at best. Now I have moved on to more challenging works like War and Peace and Ulysses. I am also attempting to read Nobel Prize winners. I just finished my first Toni Morrison book. Story 23. Mostly fantasy and science fiction. I read The Hobbit and Harry Potter in primary school, which got me into reading. Then I read The Lord of the Rings and Percy Jackson in high school, along with some Star Wars legends. When I got to college, I started buying many books from the Waterstones near my college. I have a large collection of works by Tolkien, Star Wars, Doctor Who, as well as titles like Sherlock Holmes and Unsolved Mysteries. Most recently, I acquired a biography of Sir William Marshall, who was regarded as the greatest knight of the Middle Ages. I am also interested in ancient mythology and folklore and want to get books on topics like ancient Greek mythology, the Crusades, and Arthurian legend. Story 24. I mostly read romance novels. However, I have to admit I also really enjoy fan fiction. I have a fondness for most books by Rick Riordan. Story 25. I primarily read the scriptures of my church. Additionally, I read some history books focusing on the Bible or American history. Story 26. Classic literature and fantasy are my main genres of fiction. I have read a bit of everything, though. Nonfiction is mostly history, preferably about the early modern era or early periods, and not much more recent than World War I. I read in the truck on the way to the site and during lunch breaks. Story 27. I enjoy mixing my reading selections. I usually read an easy-to-read fantasy novel, such as those related to Dungeons and Dragons, alongside a more substantial book focused on intellectual growth and self-improvement. I keep the substantial book with me to read during lunch or when I have free time, while the fantasy novel often resides next to the restroom. On average, I finish about 2 books a month, depending on the stories themselves. Story 28. Science fiction is my primary genre, followed by some fantasy and nonfiction, along with various other topics that capture my interest. I travel frequently for business, so most of my reading occurs at 35,000 feet, allowing me to get through several novels each year. You have a diverse range of genres you enjoy. Is there a specific book that stands out to you? Start there, then explore other works by the same author, followed by similar authors' writings. Repeat this process as needed. In terms of location, choose a place that helps you relax, whether it's a park or a cozy chair at home. For example, yesterday, I visited a brewery with my wife in the early afternoon, and we both wished we had brought our e-readers. Story 29. I enjoy reading science books, but I am not particularly fond of fiction. The last book I read was Skunk Works, an absolute masterpiece for anyone who likes airplanes. I don't usually read in public, but when I'm doing nothing and sitting in class, I often take out my Kindle and read for a while. Story 30. Mrs. Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children is a fantastic series. There are 4 or 5 books. I'm on book 3, and each one has been a page-turner for sure. It's a story about a boy who can see a certain type of creature and discovers a portal that allows him to travel to a different time period. I'm being vague because I don't want to give away too much, but it's a really good series and usually retails for around $15. Story 31. Science fiction, fantasy, and occasionally murder mysteries. Many books about drugs for some reason. Rarely any nonfiction. That might be why I struggle with certain topics. Story 32. Read the classics. For example, in science, there is Carl Sagan's Cosmos and Dragons of Eden. If you like fantasy or science fiction, try reading H.P. Lovecraft. It will blow your mind. Sherlock Holmes. Story 33. I commented but forgot about crime. If you're looking for a more dramatic, fictional book, Confessions of a Teenage Murder Suspect by James Patterson is a great choice. For a more realistic fiction, consider The Row by John Grisham. The Stalker by Sarah Alderson is a suspense thriller that I read back to back. It has an incredibly twisty plot, I thought I had it figured out multiple times because it seemed obvious, but then there was a huge change. Story 34. I mostly read grimdark fantasy. The First Law is a great universe, and Joe Abercrombie is fantastic at creating interesting characters. He also has another trilogy called The Shattered Sea, which is a quicker read for someone who isn't a consistent reader. While it's not as good as The First Law, it has a much faster pace and a tighter plot. If you like fantasy, I recommend both. However, with The First Law, I must warn you that the first book is light on plot. The world is divided into 3 parts. The First Law trilogy, which can be thought of as one long book split into 3 rather than 3 separate books. 3 standalone novels featuring new characters as well as some from the trilogy, each being a self-contained story that bridges the gap between the 2 trilogies. And the Age of Madness trilogy, which includes some of the original characters in supporting roles, with the main characters being all new. Story 35. I read various genres, including thrillers, fantasy, science fiction, horror, crime, and nonfiction. I often enjoy sitting in a park or on the beach while reading. If you are unsure about your interests, visit your local library, choose a few books from different genres, and start reading. If you do not enjoy a particular book, try something else, and you will soon discover what you like. Story 36. I haven't been reading much lately, but I used to read dystopian novels like The Sons of Men, 1984, and Atlas Shrugged. My favorite is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Highly recommended. Now I'm trying to read Dostoevsky, but it has been boring so far. Story 37. Fiction helps you to sleep, while nonfiction allows you to learn. Sometimes it's light nonfiction like The Art of Manliness or other easy-to-read material. Story 38. For the past couple of years, I have been reading the books assigned by my school's language arts department. Currently, I am reading Persepolis. Story 39. My 3 favorite subjects to read about are United States history, especially Black history, world history, and murder mysteries. Reading about history can either upset me or make me sad, so I sometimes take a break and read about a good street crime. Story 40. Introduction to Psychology, 8th edition, by Rita Atkinson, Richard Atkinson, and E.R. Hilgard. I do not believe in self-help. Story 41. For fiction, my tastes range from 1920s and 1930s pulp to Nero Wolfe to historical fiction. For nonfiction, I mostly enjoy history with some philosophy included, covering topics from metaphysics to social and political philosophy to logic, as well as some bizarre esoteric works. With a library of over 2,000 books, I never get bored, and I keep my mind active. Story 42. I primarily read contemporary literary fiction, as I write in that genre and enjoy discovering new works. Occasionally, I will explore an older book I might have missed or reread something I loved in the past. I also enjoy occasional philosophy or popular psychology nonfiction. Story 43. One way to engage with reading is to choose a recent bestseller that interests you. You can also explore book communities and see their top recommendations. Another idea is to read a book if you enjoy a movie adapted from it, or to try another work by the same author. Story 44. I usually have a mix of 3 or 4 books going at a time, so I can pick up whatever I'm in the mood for. Typically, I choose something easy to read, a classic, a book of poems or short fiction, and then something for work. Right now, I am reading the biography of Lou Reed by Will Hermes, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, Hell, I Love Everybody by James Tate, and Marketing Metaphoria by Gerald Zaltman. Story 45. I read a lot and love Stephen King books, historical fiction, and crime novels, just about anything that captures my interest. I recommend visiting a bookstore and browsing. I can spend hours in Barnes & Noble, reading and discovering new books. I'm concerned about mental decline since I retired a year and a half ago, so I read to keep my mind sharp. Story 46. I am reading Percy Shelley's poem, Queen Mab. I love it. I am also reading Michelle Obama's biography, Becoming. It is quite interesting. Story 47. I am currently trying to get through Game of Thrones. I reckon it will take me a couple of years. I don't have much relaxation time, and when I do, I spend it on this website. Story 48. I have many educational books, primarily in economics, psychology, and philosophy, but ultimately it depends on what I am focusing on that month. Story 49. I read a lot of biographies and historical nonfiction books, particularly about military history and various intriguing subjects. Recently, I read The Iliad to challenge myself and found it to be one of the most engaging and interesting works I had encountered in a long time. Story 50. I read What Interests Me, which ranges from fantasy to light mystery. I have read Harry Potter, The Hobbit, The Da Vinci Code, Aragon, and Gulliver's Travels. I am currently listening to the Lord of the Rings series. If you think about it, Harry Potter is more mystery than fantasy. Story 51. I primarily read fantasy and science fiction, but I try to include various nonfiction books approximately every fifth book or right after finishing a longer series. I felt a similar mental stagnation and thought I could address it while learning something new through nonfiction books. I typically choose subjects that I know little about or those that present opposing viewpoints to my usual thoughts. Story 52. I read casual fiction mostly, but I sneak in some nonfiction, biographies, and current events. I have read The Wheel of Time twice cover to cover. The second time was just before the television series started. Story 53. I am currently reading Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I recently finished Cobalt Red by Siddhartha Kara, which I thought was an absolutely phenomenal book. Just pick up a book. As long as it has some weight or meaning behind it, you will never regret it. Story 54. Currently finishing For Whom the Bell Tolls by Hemingway. Some of my favorites I have read in the past include Crime and Punishment, Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, The Partner, and 1984. Story 55. Robert A. Heinlein. That's where I got my DJ name, Grok. It's from Stranger in a Strange Land, which describes what the Martians do. Story 56. History books, romance novels, fantasy novels, manuals. Currently reading about Operation Gothic Serpent, Howl's Moving Castle, War of the Flea, and Stolen by Wolves. Story 57. I love fiction that really challenges your mind, such as Pen Pal, Fever Dream, and Tender is the Flesh. I enjoy bringing a book and arriving early to appointments to read in the waiting room instead of using my phone. Story 58. I read many fiction books on Kindle Unlimited and listened to classic novels and nonfiction on Audible. Story 59. Journals of Carl Jung. The Boskop people were known for their very large brains, which has been a subject of story and medical research. Stretch is an instructional book on stretching that addresses shoulder pain. Story 60. Police noir and science fiction. Yes and no. I read while I commute to work if the subway is not too noisy. I also used to read at work during idle time, though I rarely have any now. I read at home if the book is truly engaging or requires a lot of attention. Story 61. I fell out of practice with reading for a number of years and had trouble regaining my discipline, as a shorter attention span definitely didn't help. I started reading the Ian Fleming James Bond novels and absolutely loved them. I have read them all, along with a few post-Fleming authors in the Bond series. They are well written, have some fun action, and are really great time killers. I highly recommend them for anyone who wants to get back into the habit, but isn't inclined to read anything too heavy. Story 62. Undaunted Courage, Meriwether Lewis, Thomas Jefferson, and the Opening of the American West. Exceptionally well written and informative. Incredible does not begin to describe their remarkable experiences. Story 63. I read a lot of history books. I was immersed in reading World War I books during the 100th anniversary of the war, and it has stuck with me. Story 64. I read many tech manuals. I also listened to audiobooks, mostly science fiction. The Jack Reacher books are excellent, and the Ken Follett Century Trilogy is an amazing series. Story 65. I read a substantial amount of manga, as well as some fantasy and science fiction books. I just finished the Three Body Problem trilogy, also known as the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy, and I absolutely loved it. Story 66. It varies immensely. One day I will read classic literature. Another day I will read science fiction, fiction, nonfiction, and even poetry. I just finished reading White Fang by Jack London, and now I have moved on to The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. Story 67. Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings, Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere series, and John Irving's novel A Prayer for Owen Meany. Story 68. I started to read for pleasure and general knowledge, focusing on history. I have two books on the ancient Near East, one on Assyria and one on Babylon, 1491 by Charles Mann, Your Inner Fish by Neil Shubin, and The Horse, the Wheel, and Language. The only fiction novels I own are those I was required to read for my children's literature class. Story 69. I enjoy reading books on spirituality. My latest read was an analysis of the Mahamudra prayer, and currently, I am reading a book written by a hospice nurse about dying. Story 70. I read sports stories, history articles, comic books, and anything that catches my eye. I mainly enjoy short writings, such as pitching breakdowns in baseball or brief essays explaining historic moments. Story 71. I just finished Cannery Row by John Steinbeck. It is an absolutely fantastic book. It focuses on people, and the way Steinbeck creates a scene and an atmosphere is unparalleled. Story 72. I mainly read political science and theory books. When I need a break because they can be depressing, I usually read a biography about a musician. I read nonfiction very infrequently. The last one I read was a couple of years ago, and it was about cars. Story 73. Science fiction, fantasy, and nature themes are the focus. Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini, fantasy. Geared more towards teenage readers but fantastic nonetheless. Anything by Jim Keen, science fiction. Mostly future dystopian and cyberpunk themes. Anything by Stephen Ranella, nonfiction. Covers hunting, fishing, cooking, and conservation. The Scavenger's Guide to Haute Cuisine is an interesting attempt to recreate some recipes from Le Guide Culinaire by Auguste Escoffier using wild game. Anything by Dr. Dan Flores, nonfiction, focuses on wildlife, conservation, anthropology, and paleontology. American Serengeti explores Pleistocene-era wildlife and hunters. Coyote America examines the history of coyotes and wolves. Arctic Dreams by Barry Lopez, nonfiction, discusses the history of the Arctic, its people, and wildlife. Anything by Michael Connelly, crime fiction. The Netflix show Lincoln Lawyer and Primesbosch are both based on his books. Anything by Janet Ivanovich, crime fiction. A funny series about a female bounty hunter trying to earn money. The Devil in the White City by Eric Larson, crime nonfiction. Chronicles the Chicago World's Fair and the infamous serial killer H. Holmes. The Life of Pi by Jan Martel, fiction. The story of a boy stranded on a life raft with a tiger. The Walking Drum by Louis L'Amour, fantasy. Follows the adventures of a man searching for his father during medieval times. These are a handful of great books to get started with. Story 74. Audiobooks are my favorite now. They have been a huge game changer for me. I had given up on reading traditional books because I kept falling asleep. I just finished The Murderbot Diaries, a science fiction series by Martha Wells. It consists of 5 novellas and 2 novels. Absolutely brilliant. Story 75. If you enjoy fantasy settings, consider urban fantasy novels. They are set in modern times. 2 series I recommend are The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher and the Nightside series by Simon R. Green. Both are excellent, with incredibly memorable characters. I even named a daughter after a character from the Dresden Files. Story 76. Self-improvement books and literary analysis related to sociology can be insightful. I am currently reading Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. I recommend Iron John by Robert Bly as a similar counterpart for gender relational studies. Both works may feel dated and contain certain theories and analyses that can be debated, but they provide a good foundation. Additionally, I highly recommend Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. While it reflects some misogynistic tendencies attributable to the time period in which it was composed, it remains valuable for analyzing behavior, decision-making processes, and overarching morals within the framework of Stoicism. There is a sense of genuineness as it is a journal of a Roman emperor and general who faced everyday problems much like we all do. Story 77. I have been exploring philosophy, focusing on thinkers like Thomas Kuhn, Karl Popper, and Friedrich Nietzsche. I dabble in general business and self-help literature but prefer not to commit to entire books, especially if they seem to be written by individuals who are disconnected from the realities of classism and nepotism. I also have several books on computing and quantum physics that I plan to start within the next month or two. I have reached a new personal paradigm, and my desire for practical knowledge currently outweighs my interest in novels. However, there are some novels I will likely read in the fall. Story 78. I enjoy alternating between fiction and nonfiction. Recently, I read The Three-Body Problem, Dracula, and Frankenstein, which I really enjoyed. I also liked The Martian and Project Hail Mary. A few authors I've loved over the years include Kurt Vonnegut, John Irving, and Cormac McCarthy. For nonfiction, I enjoy reading memoirs, books about logic and critical thinking such as Scout Mindset, Macroscopic Human History like Sapiens, and a good storyteller such as Anything by Bill Bryson. I particularly love audiobooks narrated by the author. I was on Audible for a while just for those. Story 79. Fantasy and science fiction. Anything by Sanderson. The Way of Kings is a must-read. It is part of the Stormlight archive. Then there is the Mistborn series. Rufus also needs to take action, along with George R. Martin. Story 80. Nonfiction academic histories, historical fiction, science fiction, and some short stories or poetry. Story 81. I mainly read fiction for relaxation and prefer books with a geopolitical or historical background to broaden my knowledge. I also read classic science fiction. I read The Lord of the Rings yearly. The nonfiction books on my Kindle include classical philosophy, futurism, military strategy, history, and business economics. Story 82. I enjoy reading Japanese manga and light novels in English. There are many topics and themes to explore. Personally, I prefer fantasy and the isekai genre. As a Western man, reading a book from an Eastern perspective and style stimulates my thinking and encourages me to consider different viewpoints. Story 83. I only do audiobooks. I enjoy self-help genres and franchises I am already familiar with. Anything with a full cast is fun to listen to. It's like experiencing a movie or a play. Story 84. I love to read and collect books. I used to be an academic in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so I still occasionally read textbooks for fun. Besides that, I enjoy histories, biographies, science, popular science, philosophy, and various kinds of fiction. When I read historical fiction, I try to read some history from that time period. If I am reading science fiction, then I try to learn about any relevant science or technology. Story 85. For some reason, I love self-help and productivity books. I enjoy physical books, but I have recently been getting more into e-readers for reading while I am doing cardio or on the train into the city. Story 86. The Yiddish Policeman's Detective Union, Dirt Music, Suttree, In the Skin of a Lion, Jude the Obscure. Story 87. I started reading at an early age due to physical difficulties. My parents encouraged it. To this day, I read at least one book a month, often up to 3. I always keep a book handy so that if I have an extra 20 minutes or more, I will read. In terms of subjects, I enjoy history, autobiographies, and biographies. Story 88. There is a wide range of genres, primarily falling into fantasy, science fiction, or horror, each containing numerous subgenres. Additionally, there are mysteries and detective stories. I previously mentioned several subgenres, and now I want to highlight detective stories. You have the classic examples like Morse and Poirot. Then there are those firmly rooted in the fantasy genre, such as Thrax's, which reads like a typical private detective story but in a comedic fantasy setting. This continues until the background elements shift into the foreground. Conversely, there are works like The Cat Who Solved a Murder, which would likely fall on the edge of urban fantasy due to the talking cat and is generally best avoided as it lacks quality. Furthermore, there are distinctions among police investigations, private detective stories, and amateur sleuths, as well as the difference between stories where the reader knows the culprit from the start and those where the discovery unfolds throughout the narrative. Regarding specific authors and subgenres, providing proper suggestions can be challenging. For example, Star Maker is not the kind of work that most readers seek today, nor is its style particularly conducive to easy reading. However, it is significant in the history of science fiction. Story 89. Historical fiction, particularly those about real events that combine historical accuracy with fictional elements in the epilogue, is exemplified by Connie Golden's novels. Story 90. Dashiell Hammett, J.R.R. Tolkien, Fritz Leiber, Robert E. Howard, Glenn Cook, Douglas Adams, Frank Herbert, and Joe Abercrombie. Story 91. I have been working my way through the My Struggle series by Karl Ove Knausgaard. I am finally in the last few hundred pages of the last book. It has been a challenging experience, but it is also a very interesting series. Story 92. History, more importantly Black history, is essential. My most recent favorite book was Allow Me to Retort by Ellie Mistel. This offers more insight into government and politics from an educated Black American perspective. I am currently trying to find a hardcover copy of The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. In the meantime, I have reread the biographies of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Frederick Douglass. I have Freakonomics on my reread list as well. I'm a different person than I was in high school, so I want to re-examine it. Additionally, I enjoy Redwall. I have been creating a universe for a GURPS-based tabletop game, and that along with mini-campaigns of Mossrider, has been a good way to pass the time. The most recent book I read was Fallout: Equestria. I am not really into the brony community, but the combination of those two concepts as a massive Fallout fan seemed interesting enough. Story 93. History. World War II history, in particular, is absolutely fascinating. My local opportunity shop always has some World War II history books available for a couple of dollars. Story 94. I love reading books at lunch. I enjoy writing stories and I read in part for research. I'm open to just about any genre. I need to get back into finance books, but I have been heavily engaged in medieval fantasy lately. I am drawn to anything old and mystical. Story 95. It's all over the place. From Marx's Manifesto to 1984 by George Orwell to The Mortal Instruments to Terry Pratchett. Story 96. My favorite author is L. Ron Hubbard. He is a genius. I seriously love his novels and highly recommend them. Story 97. About 90% science fiction with a few other elements. The last two books I read were Circe and The Song of Achilles, and they were excellent. Story 98. I primarily enjoy reading fantasy books and some science fiction. If a book isn't traditional medieval fantasy, it usually involves steampunk themes. I occasionally read educational books but find it easier to engage with research papers or other sources for educational purposes, as educational books can sometimes become outdated due to the publishing process. I prefer not to read translated books, so I am studying Japanese to enjoy light novels and manga. I may also learn other languages for different reading experiences. Story 99. I would read fiction to help you explore the depths of human nature. Authors like Atessa Moshfegh, Ken Kesey, and David Foster Wallace might captivate you. If you enjoy science fiction, consider trying William Gibson. Story 100. I am using reading for learning at the moment. I am young, 24 years old, so I have my own life ahead of me. I am interested in reading about investing, expanding my mind to think in different ways, and anything else that captures my attention. Mainly, I focus on money management, investing, and challenging my mind. Story 101. Almost exclusively fantasy with some science fiction. I have some good casual recommendations if you tell me what kind of fantasy you like. Story 102. I spent much of my early childhood reading books like The Chronicles of Narnia, Ender's Game, the Aragon series, works by Darren Shan, Artemis Fowl, Digital Fortress, and Left Behind. These days, I find it difficult to read fiction and usually opt for articles that interest me, primarily in technology or psychology. Since I no longer attend school full-time, I don't find textbooks necessary. The best nonfiction book I have read is Freakonomics. Story 103, Science Fiction. The Foundation series by Isaac Asimov. Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke. Fantasy has many great options. If you haven't read the book Thief, The Hobbit, or The Lord of the Rings, I'm currently reading The Kingkiller Chronicle, which is brilliant. For history, a great read is the Book of Military Blunders. In self-help, my favorites include I'm Okay, You're Okay, and a recently read book on grief, It's Okay Not to Be Okay. For poetry, I wish I had read years ago Everything by Rumi and Khalil Gibran. Enjoy. Story 104, Crime Fiction. Karen Slaughter is a favorite author with a significant body of work. Horror. Stephen King is an obvious choice. Nick Cutter is another excellent horror author. Cormac McCarthy deserves his own category as he is one of my favorites. Blood Meridian and The Road were two books that had a profound impact on my taste in literature. Nonfiction. I enjoy anything historical related to my interests, such as adventure stories like Into Thin Air by John Krakauer or Pirate Hunters by Robert Kurson about finding and recovering a shipwreck. Wilderness survival stories are always compelling. I appreciate good biographies and autobiographies. One of my all-time favorites is the autobiography of David Crockett. It's worth noting that I only listen to audiobooks. I have 8 hours a day to fill at work, so I get my reading done there. Story 105. Anything by Andy Weir for realistic science fiction. The Expanse series by James S. A. Corey offers exciting science fiction. If you enjoy military zombie action, check out DJ Moles and the remaining series. Anything by Nicholas Sansbury Smith is great for science fiction and post-apocalyptic themes. Dungeon Crawler Carl is a good choice for comedy. Expeditionary Force by Craig Allen combines science fiction and comedy. He Who Fights with Monsters is recommended for fantasy and science fiction fans. The Deathless series by Chris Fox blends science fiction, fantasy, and history. Story 106. I mostly read history and try to include a biography occasionally. I'm also attempting to explore fiction, though it is challenging. I have attempted to delve into romance as a way to escape from the wars and violence. It's nice to read something with a happy ending from time to time. Story 107. Nonfiction generally presents ideas that are easier to digest. One aspect of history is that you can discover topics you enjoy. Therefore, I concentrate on what I like and seek to learn more about it. Story 108. Read what you like until you start liking what you read. My philosophy when I began to read has worked best for me. The internet constantly suggests specific books, mostly self-help. Personally, I have never found self-help books effective and never completed one that I started. That's when I adopted a different approach that I heard in one of Naval's podcasts. I began with comics and general science books. Now I read everything. Story 109. I tend to read more frequently about mathematics, physics, history, philosophy, science fiction, crime, romance, historical fiction, economics, and anything related to samurai. Story 110. Anything by Brandon Sanderson or Jasper Ford. Two wildly different authors, but both absolutely brilliant. Story 111. I enjoy reading on the beach or in parks. My favorite books usually consist of 20 incredibly dry, boring, and difficult pages that all build up to one single sentence so densely packed with meaning that it necessitates a walk to fully comprehend. Authors like Friedrich Nietzsche, Fyodor Dostoevsky, William James, and Carl Jung, as well as various religious texts, are excellent for this. Alternatively, you can choose a topic or person you find interesting and seek out the classics in that area. Don't feel pressured to force yourself to read something you're not interested in at first. If a book isn't engaging you after the first 10 pages, simply pick up another one. Story 112. Check out the podcast titled, Read Me This Book, by comedian Steve Renazizi. He invites guests to discuss their favorite books or the books they are currently reading. It was a helpful reference for me. Personally, I enjoy reading science fiction, self-improvement, and historical nonfiction. Some of my favorite titles include the Red Rising series, Warhammer 40,000, mainly Ciaphas Cain, 1 Minute After, The Mission, The Men in Me, The One Thing, Blink, and nearly anything related to the Revolutionary War. Story 113. Some authors I like are Scott Turow, Tom Clancy, John Grisham, and Stephen King. I rarely read in public. The types of books I enjoy are thrillers, true crime, some autobiographies, and the classics like those by Dickens and Nathaniel Hawthorne. As a man, I do not prefer romance books, and I am not interested in science fiction or graphic novels. It takes time to discover what you enjoy. Kudos for being interested in reading. Story 114. I have started to read the Slow Horses series of books, which is what the TV series is based on. It follows a group of spies who have made mistakes on the job. I also recommend the book, The Great Influenza. It is a history of medicine leading up to and during the Great Influenza, also known as the Spanish flu. I am currently partway through the memoir of Christopher Hitchens, titled Hitch 22. Story 115. I am a self-help book enthusiast. I have a daily devotional on being a model father, a book on anger management, and I am listening to a book about biohacking. Story 116. I take the train home from work, and it's great to have an hour to read. I struggle to find the motivation to read at home. Currently, I am reading The Trading Game by Gary Stevenson. While I don't aspire to be a trader, I can relate to growing up poor and trying to find my place in life. Story 117. Now I'm alternating between a nonfiction book and a science fiction or fantasy novel. Whenever Some People Need Killing gets too upsetting, I switch to The Unpleasant Profession of Robert A. Heinlein. Story 118. The Legend of Drizzt series and the Dante Valentine series have been my go-to books outside of Star Wars novels for the past year or so. I wish I had all the Drizzt books, but there are so many, and I'm on a tight budget. Story 119. I can never recommend Discworld enough. This comedic fantasy and some of the best satire ever written. I suggest either Mort or Small Gods as good starting points. Story 120. I read in the dark with a Kindle. My attention deficit hyperactivity disorder has worsened over time, and I struggle to read anything much longer than an article in public. I either read in bed if I am alone, or I pull all the curtains, turn off every light, and make time to read otherwise. I read a variety of genres and try to rotate. I avoided fantasy and science fiction for most of my life due to bad formative experiences with J.R.R. Tolkien and Isaac Asimov, but started incorporating them a few years ago. I've managed to find a fair amount of good material, along with some absolute drivel. The only nonfiction I read regularly is history. Currently, I am reading Jeremy Popkin's A New World Begins. The history of the French Revolution, alternating that with a collection of cosmic horror titled Shadows of Carcosa. Here are some random recommendations: science fiction and action, The Expanse series; literary fiction, Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, a sort of metafiction about his time in Vietnam. Crime and noir is basically my home base for genre fiction. Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, and Jim Thompson are masters of the genre. For a non-reader trying to get into the habit, I would suggest this is the best genre to explore. The novels are engaging, and the writing generally has the highest average caliber of genre fiction. You won't be slogging through Red Harvest like it's Moby Dick, which, for the record, is a genuinely great read and also exciting, but you'll need to accept a lot of minutiae. Story 121. I read a lot, pretty much any genre except chick lit. Yes, I enjoy reading in public. I had a really nice time last week. The weather was good. I went for a long walk and took my Kindle with me, stopping a couple of times to sit in parks and read. If you don't know what kind of books you like, see if there's a library nearby and start trying different authors to find one you enjoy. However, if you want recommendations based on the genres of television you watch, here are some suggestions. Fantasy, Terry Pratchett, Jim C. Hines. Crime, mystery, thriller, Christopher Brookmeyer. Science fiction, Andy Weir, Becky Chambers. Story 122. I have been reading many nonfiction books about financial scandals, including several by Michael Lewis, such as The Big Short and Moneyball. Story 123. I enjoy exploring the mechanics of complex hard magic systems or theoretically plausible futuristic technologies, so I primarily read fantasy and science fiction. I am fascinated by how these systems work, allowing me to have some understanding of how scenarios might play out. Story 124. We Are Legion, We Are Bob is a great science fiction series about a man who is transformed into a sentient space probe. There is more to it, and I highly recommend it. Old Man's War is a modern take on space warfare. Armor is a military science fiction story that features an impressive portrayal of a warrior character. Story 125. I mainly read fiction but will read one non-fiction book a year. Favorite books I have read this year include Demon Copperhead, A Gentleman in Moscow, Beartown Trilogy, and An Immense World. Non-fiction. Story 126. Mostly science fiction and fantasy, especially old pulp fiction by Clark Ashton Smith. However, I also explore non-fiction and genres outside my comfort zone. Story 127. It really depends on my mood and setting. I sometimes read during my work lunch. When I do, I typically choose lighter fiction. Recently, I've been going through Warhammer Orc books. If I'm reading at home before bed, I can dedicate more time to heavier non-fiction subjects, often focusing on theology. Based on recommendations, I finished Tribe and Freedom by Sebastian Junger, and am about a third of the way through They Thought They Were Free. At times, I may not be in the mood for that, so I will continue with the already recommended Red Rising series. Story 128. I read frequently, often while on the train or in the park. I mainly enjoy fiction and graphic novels, but I also appreciate nonfiction. Just join a library and immerse yourself in books. Or, like me, create your own library with over 20,000 books and counting. Story 129. Science fiction and fantasy, along with some self-study language books, mythology, fairy tales, and self-improvement books. Story 130. I don't read often, so I am not familiar with many authors. However, I enjoy the works of Stephen King and biographies of musicians or other interesting public figures. Story 131. You could start with The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's a fun read that introduces you to Middle-earth. Originally, it's a children's tale. Once you've read that, if you enjoyed it, I would suggest The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. This is a more serious, save-the-world kind of story. After that, you could give Wheel of Time a look. Although this is a fairly long series, it's become my favorite series to read. If you enjoyed The Hobbit, but find The Lord of the Rings too much, you could try The Chronicles of Narnia. It consists of 7 books, but they are quite small unless you get the complete edition, which includes all 7 in one volume. There's also Redwall by Brian Jacques. Although there is an order to the books, they are fairly standalone. I think he ended up writing 21 of them. I never read them all, but I quite enjoyed them when I was in grades 4 to 8. All of these titles are in the fantasy genre. But if you fancy reality, you could always look at American Sniper. The book was written by Chris Kyle about his time in Iraq. If you've seen the movie, forget his portrayal. He didn't regret being overseas at all. He discusses his training, Bud/S, and Hell Week. He describes his missions and even talks about events at home when he was on leave, including the frustration of not being able to take down potential threats until they shot at him or his team. He mentions that when he was deployed, he rarely got so much as a scratch, but when he was home, he was accident-prone. It's a good book, and it's a shame he was killed by a former soldier he was trying to rehabilitate who was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder from the war in Iraq. Happy reading. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.